All right, welcome to today's Ask the Expert virtual workshop. We are recording today's session so that others who aren't able to attend are able to view the workshop later on. This event is being co-hosted by the Lewis and Clark chapter of the Society of Human Resource Managers and the Missouri Job Center of St. Charles County. So my name is Lori Myers, and I'm the operations manager here at the Job Center, and I'm also the workforce readiness chair on the Lewis and Clark SHRM board. And with me today are our panelists, to include Becky Feldman. Becky is the Assistant Vice President, Senior Employee Experience Designer for Talent Management at Commerce Bank. Becky also serves as the Programs Chair on the Lewis and Clark SHRM board. Michelle Harper. Michelle is the Director of Human Resources for the Newberry Group, and Michelle serves as the Secretary for the Lewis and Clark SHRM chapter. And Marcy Whelan. Marcy is the Senior Talent Acquisition Consultant for ROI Search Partners, and Marcy is the President-elect of the Lewis and Clark SHRM board. So thank you all for being here today. I know we have a lot of great topics to cover, and like I mentioned earlier, participants are encouraged to ask questions in the chat feature. So let's just jump right in. So Becky, what type of resume do you view as most effective?
So the most effective resume is a chronological resume for a number of reasons. So this is the old school resume. I think a lot of people have gotten really fancy with resumes, and we really need to go back to basics here and use that chronological resume. The reason why this is the most effective resume is because it really for the recruiter or the hiring manager to be able to follow your work history and determine if you're a fit for the role. I know a lot of people feel like they might want to use a functional resume if they might have gaps in their employment, but that usually tells the recruiter or the hiring manager maybe that you're hiding something. So I think it's best to show your career progression and really tell your story, even if there are holes, especially at this point in time with a lot of people who are unemployed. Tell your story and how you were impacted and show the gaps. I think that's absolutely appropriate, and continue on with the chronological resume. The other reason for using the chronological resume is that it parses better into an applicant tracking system. So if you've ever come across that where it says attach your resume and it's going to kind of shoot your information into the fields on the application, chronological resume is formatted perfectly for that. So that's another reason. And then lastly, you can really create a strong summary or an objective and also a skills section on a chronological resume. I think sometimes that's why people would tend more towards a functional resume. But you can still do that on chronological. You can use that very top section on your resume to share your story and to really show where you've been and where you're going and really what you love to do, followed by a skills section. That skills section, you can share even soft skills and you can share systems that you have experience with. So you can absolutely do that on a chronological resume. And then after that section, follow it up with your work history. Including progression of titles, even within the same company. So if you've been with the same company for 15 years, make sure that you're showing progressive responsibilities within that organization to help the recruiter, again, see your story. A few other things that are important to remember on your resume is that you don't need to get fancy with fonts or pictures. Really keep it simple. You don't want to include your address either. You can include the city and the state, so that the recruiter or the hiring manager knows that you don't need to relocate, for example, but you don't want to include your address. And the reason for that is because there's a lot of bias, I think, inherently in this process. And so you don't want to introduce any more into the process. And kind of along those same lines, use an appropriate email address. Don't include your Hotmail address. That is something funny that maybe you use since high school. Make sure that it's an appropriate email address. And also don't have your birth year. I think a lot of the time, some of those are suggestions that some of these email providers might have where they'll include your birth year. But again, take out whatever that birth year is. Don't have it be your first name, your last name, and your birth year. Again, that's another opportunity where you are potentially hurting yourself and introducing more bias into the process by doing that. So make sure that that's removed. And then lastly, I would suggest once you have your resume complete, make sure that it's tailored for that particular role and not just a general resume. Make sure that summary speaks to the role that you're applying for. And then save it in a PDF and upload it in a PDF instead of in Word. That's another way to ensure that the formatting stays intact, no matter how the recruiter or the hiring manager might be viewing it in their applicant tracking system or via email, via mobile device. We know that things get a little bit wonky on mobile devices. So just make sure that it's in a PDF so that it's clean no matter how someone opens your resume. And I know Marcy and Michelle, you guys look at resumes all day long. So what did I miss?
Yeah, so really great points, Becky. A lot of helpful information there. So one thing I would add is, yeah, you touched on it, is really looking at that job description and making sure that your resume is hitting those basic qualifications. So applicant tracking systems these days can be set up to really pick up those basic qualifications. So if you know you have that criteria as experience that you pulled, make sure that you're matching that up and including that on your resume. So oftentimes those basic qualifications are not detailed on the resume. So you can easily get rejected by not having those on there that you may otherwise think, oh, they'll likely know I have that experience, but definitely take the time to get those basic qualifications outlined on your resume.
I think you guys did a great job. I can't think of anything else to add at this time.
Well, Marcy, the one thing you've told me in the past is those stats around how long a recruiter looks at a resume.
Oh, yeah, good point, Becky. So it will probably come to a surprise to a lot of you that a recruiter typically looks at a resume on average 4 to 6 seconds. So when Becky talks about that profile statement being so critical, that is what's going to gain their attention. And when Michelle says you want to pair a lot of your experience back to the job description, leverage that profile statement for all of that. You want to show where you've been, where you're looking to go, and the passion that you have, and how it succinctly really pairs back to the actual job description. That's going to get the recruiter's attention and keep them reading.
Can you guys cover too, real quick, how far back someone should go on their resume and the length of a resume?
Yep. Marcy, I think you've got that one.
All right. So, you know, the old school thought is that a resume should be no more than 1 page. I have seen people try to put more stuff on 1 page without writing in the margins, right? And so it's too overwhelming. I would say that realistically, if you have 10 to 15 years plus experience, it's okay for it to flow into page 2. Especially if all of that experience is relevant to the job that you are applying to. If you start getting into the internship that you had right out of college 25 years ago that really has no relevance to the job you're applying for, that's when you can go ahead and take it off. Now, if you really start bleeding into 3 and 4 pages, you may want to really start to evaluate whether or not you need to scale back. But certainly 2 pages is not unrealistic.
Awesome. Okay, so let's go on to the question of how do we get around applying online and how do we get to a real person?
So I love this question. You really can't get around applying online. I think even small businesses today are using some pretty simple applicant tracking systems, and there's reasons for using applicant tracking systems to ensure fairness, really, and to streamline hiring. So I think the answer is you're not going to get around it, so how do you work with it? I think making sure that your resume is formatted correctly for the applicant tracking system, and you don't have to know what the applicant tracking system is looking for, but just using that chronological resume, I think, is a very good first step and making sure that it's formatted correctly for an ATS. Making sure that you are, putting your jobs in order, putting the company, the dates, all of that stuff that is really, really basic. That's what the applicant tracking system is looking for. I think there is a myth also that an applicant tracking system is going to reject an applicant based off of their resume. And that's not necessarily true, that it's going to reject your application. I don't know that to be the case with any of the applicant tracking systems that I worked with, that it's going to look at a resume and say, you don't work, you don't fit. What it does do is reject based off of responses to pre-screening questions. So if the application says, do you have XYZ or, years of experience or qualifications, make sure that you answer that in an appropriate way. That is what is going to determine if you make it to the next round or not, especially for some of these applicant tracking systems and organizations that have really high volume coming in. They are going to utilize those pre-screen questions. So make sure that you're answering those honestly and appropriately. That's what's going to make sure you get to the next step and get to a person. The other thing I wanted to point out about an applicant tracking system is that it can do the reverse search. So as you are preparing your resume, make sure that you have those keywords on there or qualifications that are needed for the types of roles that you're looking for. Because a lot of the times a recruiter, if they have a hard to fill job or if they're not getting candidates for a particular role that really match their criteria, they will do a search within their applicant tracking system. Well, they will put in keywords for particular skills, maybe even systems, and they have lots of different ways to search. So they're searching on the back end to try to find people who are in their applicant tracking system to try to match them to another role. And I know, Michelle, you've shared with me some times where you have done that in your role.
Yes, absolutely. So like Becky said, sometimes there's just so many candidates, so many applications, and in this current pandemic state that we're living in, you really have to stand out. So if you have certifications, make sure those are listed on your resume. Even if they're not required, listing those, because, when keyword searches come into play, those are things that, we can resort to as, let's look at certified applicants, let's look at those that have a quill in, XYZ software, so those keywords are certainly very important. So using the name, of it and making sure that it's spelled correctly is important too, so that gets picked up.
Yeah, and speaking of spelled correctly, it sounds silly, but really make sure that on your resume, whatever you're uploading to a ATS, you have all of your contact information on there and it is correct. Because if a recruiter cannot get a hold of you, even if they've done the search and they find your resume and they're super excited about your skill set and how it aligns, if you don't have the appropriate contact information on there, they're not going to be able to reach out to you.
Awesome. Great information. Next question to go over. What are some of the best practices for networking in a COVID world?
This had to happen one time. I'm on mute, right?
You're unmuted.
Go here. Has to happen once, at least in every call. So use LinkedIn. I know this seems like a no-brainer also. But that is the virtual platform that we have for networking. And one thing that I saw recently from a job seeker, someone that I used to work with that I thought was super creative, a lot of people are looking for jobs right now. So I don't think it's super effective to post on LinkedIn that I'm looking for XYZ job, because it is probably very rare that that job exists. The job that you used to have, that's open at another organization. That's probably very, very rare. So what I encourage you to do instead, as more of a networking opportunity, is try to create a post to ask if anybody is open to a conversation around a specific topic. So this particular individual was working in organizational development. So his post was something around, I'm really interested in best practices around organizational development and adult learning theory. So start a post with that and see if anybody is open to a conversation about, again, a particular topic that you are passionate about, have experience with, that might lead to an eventual conversation about a role. Another point is really use your first level network to help make connections to the next level. It really helps to have a mutual connection to help make that introduction. I know you can reach out to anyone and everyone on LinkedIn usually, but it does help to have that mutual connection and sometimes to even lean on them to help make the connection to the other person. And then lastly, what I would say just about virtual networking, the same way that I would say with in-person networking, the goal isn't to connect with a million people. The goal should be to make a few meaningful connections. So there is an exercise that I suggest doing, and this might create a list for you. So sit down and really think about the people that you would like to either connect with or reconnect with to help you be more purposeful in seeking out conversations. So some examples that I kind of jotted down are things like someone who I used to go to lunch with, someone who always shares great content, someone who I've never met, but I'd love to connect with, and maybe they have more time in this virtual world that they might connect with me virtually versus in person. So start to kind of create that list, and I think that'll help kind of grow your to-do for networking in a more purposeful way so that you know what you want to get out of that conversation. So I don't know if anybody else has anything to add to that.
I think that sounds great.
Yes, definitely echo the LinkedIn, also networking within, other organizations that you may be in. So, if you're in various chapters or entities that have to do with your profession, whether it's society for this or that, or, whatever it may be, even if it's not related to professional networking, just simply networking, whether it's social networking or professional networking, it's all valuable and it all plays into, helping you with that next step.
Yeah.
And I've heard, I've had so many colleagues over the years say, you know what, I got heads down in my job for 15 plus years and I did not do my due diligence on networking. And now I feel completely lost in that. So if you feel that, trust me, you're not alone. However, the best way to avoid that in the future is take a little bit of time, 2 to 3 minutes every day for the rest of your career, and just whether you're putting content out there on LinkedIn or connecting with someone that maybe you saw something in the business journal and you're like, oh, that company's kind of interesting, try to connect with someone from that company because you have interest in them, or meet when we eventually get back to the point where you can meet for coffee and things like that. Don't be afraid to reach out and say, I'd love to learn a little bit more about you and your company. Even if you're not looking for a job, you should always think about how to network, and eventually you get better at it.
Yeah. And another piece with that too, I know we're talking about networking in a virtual world, but I was one of those people that was really heads down in my job, in my career, at the same organization for a very long time. And it really was just the last 5 years that I started to really look kind of outside and really grow and build connections and relationships. And it led to, other opportunities. But where that started really was involvement on boards of organizations that I care about. So, I think this would be a great time to start, while you are virtual, to start looking at organizations that you care about and that you align with their mission. And see if there is an opportunity to join their board. And it doesn't have to be in a leadership role. Maybe there's some sort of subcommittee role that you can just raise your hand for to start to build relationships until we're back in person and having in-person meetings and conversations. But this might be a great way to start building your list of where you might want to get involved and grow your network.
That's some great advice, everyone. So moving on, next topic is how can I stand out from the crowd? And what is the importance of personal branding?
Well, this is what I love, is personal branding. So, and it's very, very hard to do. So just like Marcy said, if you feel like you've been head down for a while and you're just starting, I think that's the same way with personal branding. You just got to take a step. And I think the first step to take is really learning how to tell your story, and what you love to do and what makes you you. So, you know, it's not talking about the job that you have. It's talking about the work that you do and what you love, and, you know, what you bring to the table. So LinkedIn is a great way to really build your personal brand and kind of your digital footprint in the professional world. And so with LinkedIn, just like a recruiter looks at a resume for just a couple of seconds, that's the same way that happens with a connection who looks at your profile on LinkedIn. So if you think about a mobile device versus a desktop, you have even less space to tell your story and get someone to want to read more. So I have just a few tips on how to help you stand out on LinkedIn. And it really is, again, around telling your story. And don't let LinkedIn read like a resume for you. You want to not only tell kind of what you do, what you're passionate about, what you bring to the table, but I also want you to get a little bit personal. Share what sports team, you know, you are crazy about. If there's a hobby that you have, share that. That is something that stands out to a recruiter and will start a conversation. Learn how to talk about your accomplishments too, and what you care about. And if you don't do this and don't get personal, you are going to look like everyone else when you don't take that extra step to show why you're unique. I also encourage you to use an appropriate profile picture. It doesn't have to be a professional picture, meaning taken by a professional. It can be a picture that you took, you know, on your smartphone, but it does have to be of you and only you, and it should be professional looking, so that it is work appropriate. And then I also encourage you to use a background pic. The picture that shows up behind your profile is a default from LinkedIn. It's like a little connection kind of starry background, but you have the opportunity to represent your brand, and put a background there that's meaningful to you. So maybe it's a hobby, maybe you like skiing, maybe you like hiking, maybe you are a big sports fan. You know, share a background that's meaningful, and again, always to the aim of starting a conversation with someone and making you stand out from the crowd.
Any follow-up thoughts?
Hey, Becky, you shared the other day about the your headline on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
You want to talk a little bit about that? That was really good.
I will. Yeah, so another kind of thing that people don't know is that LinkedIn will default your headline to your current job title. So job titles, we all know because we work in HR, are very specific to our organizations. Don't mean a whole lot outside of our organizations. So I recommend that you change your headline to read in a way that has key search terms, that it's searchable by recruiters or hiring managers, or even people who are just looking to connect with other people in that particular area. So mine, you can see how it's formatted if anybody wants to go visit my profile. And I think Marcy's is the same way. And Michelle, I haven't been out to 2 years in a while to see what it looks like, but break it up with words that tell your story instead of your job. And I think, again, that's so hard to do. We always default to the job that we have. And that's the way that we introduce ourselves. But if I introduce myself with the job title that I have, no one knows what that means. So I have to tell the story so that people can connect with, oh, that's what that means. That's what she cares about. That's what she does. And again, it's search friendly too, for recruiters, or again, hiring managers, or someone who's just looking to connect with someone who's in my space.
Awesome. All right, so moving on, how do you suggest one prepare for an interview, whether that's in person, over the phone, or maybe a video conference?
Sure. So first and foremost is you want to study the job description, which we talked about earlier for your resume, but you want to refresh it. You want to make sure that you understand exactly what they're looking for and prepare examples of how your experience lines with what the company is looking for. So your goal here is to get the interviewer to see you in the job. In addition, you want to take time to learn about the company. You want to go through their website, any press releases that have come out about recent press releases on the company, etc. And then you want to be able to sprinkle that knowledge gained through about the company during the interview where it's appropriate. You don't want to overdo it, but really what you're doing here is showing that you've done your homework and that you are genuinely excited about not only the job, but also the company as a whole. And ask questions. Ultimately, you want to make sure that this is the right position for you and the right company for you. And so you want to make sure that you, as well as the person that's interviewing you, is making the right decision. From a dress standpoint, no matter if you are in person, if you are via video conference, dress professionally. And I would also even venture to say, if you're having a phone interview, do the same, because once you're kind of dressed professionally, you get in that mindset as well. Have your resume available for reference and or to distribute. So whether you're in person or via webcam or on the phone, have it there for reference, either for yourself or for the parties involved. And if video, ensure that you have the site downloaded in advance and that you can confirm that you're able to navigate getting into the meeting prior to the scheduled interview. Join a few minutes early, just as you do when you're showing up for an interview. Now there's a sweet spot here, right? You want to give yourself plenty of time so that you're not rushing and that you get kind of frazzled by that, but you also don't want to show up too early and be that person either. So I would say 5 minutes or so prior to any interview is realistic for that. So yeah, any thoughts, Michelle or Becky? Anything I missed?
I've got a few, and one I just read the other day. If it is a virtual interview and you're doing it via Zoom or whatever platform, if you have the opportunity to turn off the self view, I would encourage you to do that. And the article talks a lot about, think about if you were sitting in person in an interview with a hiring manager or even a team, and you had a mirror in front of you watching yourself speak, how distracting is that and nerve-wracking is that? So turn off the self view if you can. I mean, your camera is still going to be on. They're still going to be able to see you and your reactions, but you don't have to look at that because we're always judging ourselves. And so take that off the table. You don't need that extra stress in that environment. And then the other thing is, again, another basic that I don't know why we as HR professionals don't teach candidates better, and that is how to respond to interview questions. I believe that we want candidates to succeed. I mean, nobody wants to get into an interview that's just terrible and that fails. I mean, there's a lot of time that we spend vetting candidates. So why don't we teach them the test and help them put their best foot forward? And that's by teaching them how to respond to the questions. Not telling them the questions that we're going to ask necessarily, but helping them to understand the types of questions that we'll ask and how they can prepare, and then how to respond. So for example, a lot of organizations use behavior-based questions. And the way that you should respond really to any interview question is with the STAR methodology. And what that means is you present the situation, task or action, and then share the result. So as you go through your response, make sure you're touching on all of those points so that you actually get to answering the question. I think a lot of the times a candidate will just keep talking and talking and talking, and then there's no real answer to the question. The recruiter's thinking, well, what do I write down? What did I actually hear? And so it's not, there's really no benefit to either one of the parties in that. So again, keep that STAR methodology in mind. You can even Google that and look at sample questions, and it'll also give you sample responses for STAR so that you can really see that kind of structure breakdown. And the other suggestion is really to focus on what you did in that situation, for example. Instead of talking about the team, really call out what you did so that they know who you are and how you solved a particular problem. And then lastly, the result of the particular example that you share does not have to be positive. So if you talked about a particular situation that did not end well, I think it's okay to share that result and how it was not necessarily positive. I think that shows, honesty and transparency, but then also you have an opportunity to share what you learned and how you think differently for the future.
Great advice. Any thoughts on what people should avoid doing during a virtual interview, as far as like background noises and things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So as it relates to video conference etiquette, so in addition to to all of the above mentioned, right, all those things that we mentioned before, you want to make sure that you're in a quiet place with an appropriate professional background. A couple hints here: having a window directly behind you and the camera's view can cast a glare and it make it difficult for the interviewer to see you, which can be very distracting. Also, little tongue-in-cheek here, but if you had a party last night, you want to make sure that the bottles and the trash are out of sight, right? Essentially what I'm saying is make your space visibly tidy so that you're avoiding any distractions for the interviewer. Ensure that your internet connection is stable, that your computer audio is working, your webcam is up and working. Close any unnecessary web browsers, tabs, and applications. Dress professionally and avoid bright colors. I think the joke right now is that everyone's kind of dressed professionally from the top up, right? And we're all in our sweatpants and flip-flops, whatever that takes. But what is visible, you want to make sure is very professional. Also, on top of that, you want to have a pen, a notepad, and a copy of your resume on your desk so that you can take notes. You won't be fumbling along the way. If there's anything that you feel like you need to write down, or if you need to reference anything in your resume, you want to make sure that you have it handy so you're not fumbling to find that. Listen, nod, and smile and show that you are engaged. Obviously, you're not slouching and things like that, which is also important when you're in person. And then, use hand gestures when appropriate. Don't feel like you have to sit completely stiff either. And then make sure that you put your phone on silent mode. You don't need any external distractions, and that goes for whether you're in person or via video or even having a phone interview for that matter. You don't want any outside noises or distractions that will take you away from what you're trying to share. A couple of other things that maybe I didn't share with respect to in-person, I just want to make sure that I cover as well. When it comes to handshake, make sure that you practice. It sounds silly, but you don't want a handshake to be overly firm or not firm at all. You want it to be right there in the middle. You want to make sure that your body language, not only on video conference, but in person, you're sitting up straight, you're not slouching, you're not fidgeting, and you're looking genuinely interested in the interview process. Keep good eye contact without staring or looking around the room too much. Either one is going to not set well with whomever it is that you're interviewing with. And no matter what, be prepared. But don't monopolize the time or overshare. I think oversharing was one of the things that Becky shared earlier, and there's a little bit more that I want to share on that here in a minute. But make sure that you have enough self-awareness that if you have a tendency to talk too long or talk too short, that you're aware of that and you develop strategies to avoid doing so, and then kind of getting in your head about it and fumbling around, right? So you don't, and you don't want to forget to pause. Pauses are okay as well. And
And
really,
Marcy, there's
yeah.
a question in chat too.
Oh, yeah.
Don't wear bright colors. Do you have more to share about that?
Sure, absolutely. Bright colors or anything that's real busy. So, you know, for example, I don't know if you can see, but I have kind of this, I don't know, this animal print on today. It's fine, right? But if I had a fuchsia colored shirt on with a big necklace and maybe even a coat over the top of it, that would be pretty distracting during the interview process. What you want to do is you want to look professional, but you don't want to have anything that is going to distract or deter from the content in which you are trying to get across and share with the person that you're interviewing with. Is that helpful?
How much talking is oversharing?
If your gut tells you that you've gone too far on one topic, wrap it up quickly, pause, and see what the party across from you is responding like. So if your interviewer moves on to the next topic, next question, then you're like, okay, I've spoke way too much about that particular topic, reset and move forward. I would say that any given question, you shouldn't really have more than, I don't know, 3 to 5 minutes of engagement on any particular question. Unless
And
it's
one thing that I do, Marcy, just in conversation, even if, you know, not an interview necessarily, but I always check for understanding. And so my phrase that people probably hear me say all the time is, does that make sense? So I always check for understanding. And so maybe that's not your phrase. Maybe there's something else that's more appropriate for the interview. But was that helpful? Just to make sure that you're checking for understanding.
Absolutely. And you want to have fun with it, and you want to be who you are. Remember, again, that it is important that you are enjoying the process and getting your questions answered as much as it is for the company. You want to make sure it's the right fit. And show gratitude too. Don't forget that. Manners are always welcome, no matter what scenario you're in. And so thank them for their time and show that you appreciate how far you've gotten in the process and the excitement level that you have around the potential opportunity.
Awesome. So our other 2 topics, I think you guys have covered very well, but you know, in-person interview etiquette and video conference etiquette. Anything else you guys want to add to those topics?
In person, if you're offered a bottle of water, take it. Couple of reasons. First of all, sometimes when you get nervous, your mouth can get a little dry, and that way you have that water handy and it doesn't distract for you or the person that's interviewing you. Also, accepting a bottle of water seems really insignificant. However, it's welcoming and appreciative gesture by accepting it.
The other thing, Marcy, that I wanted to bring up, and Michelle, you probably have some thoughts around this too, is really in response to follow-up after interview. So sharing the appreciation during the interview, as far as, you know, thankful that you got this far, but before you leave that interview, when they ask, do you have any questions? I hope that you have questions, but also ask, what is your timeline for filling this role? And maybe even ask, and maybe there's a better way to ask this, so you guys correct me here, but when can I expect to hear back? Because I think that helps to set expectations so that when you follow up, and that helps the candidate plan their follow-up timeline so that they're not bugging the recruiter or the hiring manager if they know that timeline. So what would you guys say about that?
Yeah, I think if the interviewer does not close with kind of the expectation for next steps, I certainly think it's appropriate to ask, you know, what to expect going forward, you know, whether that's, you know, they're making their hiring decision this week or it's a couple of weeks from now, we're still interviewing more. Definitely asking is definitely the right thing to do. And that shows your interest level, you know, sometimes in interviews, it may not be a fit for either party. So if that's not addressed, then that can be taken as, well, maybe the candidate wasn't interested, in moving forward in the process. And not that self-removes you, but it's just always good to show that that continued interest. So definitely worth asking that question if it's not communicated at the end. And to answer the question about the bottle of water, I certainly think, yes, if you have your own water bottle with you, by all means, not necessary to have one more thing that you have to have, in your possession. So I think that's definitely okay to, let them know, no, thank you.
Awesome. So this is a topic, a couple bullets down from what we had discussed, but I think it's appropriate now. So when and how should
Hey, Lori.
Yes.
So just staying on this topic for a few more moments. So we have a question related to the employer getting busy. Is it okay to ask them? Is it okay to ask if I can contact you if I don't hear from you? So yes, I think that it's certainly okay to, depending on who you're interviewing with, so maybe you already have that person's contact information, whether it's a recruiter or an HR representative, you likely already have their email information or their phone number. If it's with the hiring manager, I think it's certainly okay to ask. Sometimes hiring managers are okay with providing their email. They may just say, can you reach back out with Marcy, and she'll be able to communicate with you from here. So it's definitely a valid and, acceptable question by all means, and they'll let you know, what's the, appropriate contact from that point forward. So it just depends really on the organization of what their practice is.
Absolutely. And never underestimate the power of a handwritten note. However, you want to be able to balance that following interview with a quick email within, 12 to 24 hours that really kind of describes, hey, really enjoyed my time talking with you. Make sure you mention the job title so that it refreshes the person who interviewed you's memory. Address them by how he or she introduced themselves during the interview. Some people prefer to go, if they're a doctor, Dr. Smith or George, whatever that looks like, right? Make sure that you are careful in those details and confirm your interest in that email and in that handwritten note. And then in terms of frequency, make sure that, I would say you don't want to reach out more than once a week, but you want to also go with what feels right based on the interaction, kind of what Michelle was saying, right? You want to show interest and you want to show continued engagement and you want to be top of mind for them. But you're recognizing also that there's a lot of moving parts internal within a company, and filling this job, absolutely top priority 95% of the time. However, they have other priorities that can kind of pull them away. And so you want to be able to be top of mind without being, without seeming too overly aggressive.
Yeah. And I would say in that follow-up email, it's not just thanking them for their time. I think, Marcy, you mentioned sharing why you're a fit, but make sure you use that follow-up email for a way to kind of reiterate your branding and just, who you are. So share something that you learned in that interview, or now that you learned a little bit more about a particular project, how you might see yourself contributing. So share some ideas that you have as you've had time to think about it after the interview. That might even start another conversation with that thank you.
I recently had a candidate who, to kind of frame it up, we had 3 candidates that interviewed for a job. 2 of them did send a follow-up email, which was very polite. They CC'd me on it just so that I was kind of in the know. But the 3rd candidate not only sent individual emails to everyone that she interviewed with, but she also included a 6-month strategic plan that if she were to be the one onboarded, that these are the types of things that she would do. So what she really did there was stand out from the other two, and to really put herself in a position that said, wow, we can see her in this role. And the committee who I am working with made a comment. I mean, it stuck out to me. And then as soon as I get on a call with the entire committee, that is the first thing that they said was, wow, impressive. We did not ask her to put together that 6-month plan, but she did it. So it's little things, not to say that everyone has to put together a 6-month plan, but to Becky's point, you know, how is it that you work to really stand out in that communication?
Mhm.
Awesome. So just to clarify, so when should you follow up and how often should you follow up? Should you give up after maybe a couple follow-up attempts, or what do you recommend?
Yeah, I would say that no more than once a week. And depending on the feel and what kind of communication you're getting back, and Michelle, Becky, weigh in on this. I would say if you haven't heard anything from them within 30 days, I would probably let it go. If you've reached out 4 times over the course of a month and you haven't heard back at all, perhaps it's not the right fit for you.
Yeah, I think, so to address the question on follow-up, I would say the same day. It doesn't need to be in the same hour that you've interviewed, but sending a thank you email same day is important. And if you don't know the email address of who you interviewed with, you know, simply saying, hey, you know, would you pass this along to so-and-so, you know, because that recruiter or HR representative is always happy to forward your thank you message. And then secondly, you know, after you've had time to kind of debrief and collect your thoughts after an interview, if there's a question or two that maybe you feel like, oh man, I really botched that one, you know, maybe there's more context that you want to share that you feel is really important in that decision-making process or that review process that will be occurring, you know, in the days following. So I think that's also an important time where you can kind of touch on something that, you know, hey, I want to share this information in case it wasn't completely communicated in the way that I had hoped or something. So I think those are important. And then two, employers, some utilize the candidate rejection email to let you know, when you've been removed from the hiring process or the selection process rather. So you will receive those, but I would say, you know, it's kind of 50-50. Some employers utilize them and others, you know, really wait until they know for sure that they've selected the right candidate and then that person started and working out. So sometimes that's why we don't see those when we, you know, would really like to get some type of, you know, feedback, even if it is that rejection message. So but yes, I would say, you know, after 30 days, to Marcy's point, it's certainly time to, you know, probably cease reaching out if you haven't heard back. So.
Yeah, and I think to keep in mind too with that, you know, might be considered for another role in the future. So we kind of be careful with that follow-up.
Mm-hmm.
They don't say, oh my gosh, you know, Becky just kept emailing. Because it may just be that you weren't a fit for that particular role, but they really liked you, you know, and I would hope that organizations would share that and say, you know what, Becky, you weren't a good fit for this role, but we can see maybe another role in the future that we want to keep you in mind for. And you always want to keep that door open. So just make sure that the way that you behave and respond to the rejection to that particular role speaks to your character for another position.
Awesome. All right, last topic on the list is what is a major knockout factor for you in an interview?
First and foremost, I would say oversharing. I think we've addressed this a couple times during this, during this presentation, but when you don't answer questions succinctly, you start to kind of overshare, and it can be very distracting, and it really, the perception is that you aren't prepared for the interview. So that's really important. Talking negatively about former or current employers is not ever a good thing. And so what I say there is I have heard throughout 17 plus years of doing this, people that do it really well, and I'm always impressed because maybe I know some of the backstory, and maybe there was a major layoff at a company and it was heart-wrenching and a lot of people were impacted, but that person that I'm talking to that was part of that um, you know, that particular layoff, they practiced well and they came to the table with, you know what, I had X number of years of experience with XYZ company, and I appreciate it every single year, and I learned so much, and let me tell you a little bit more about that. Things like that put a positive spin, even though if you're hurting in the moment, frustrated, angry, whatever that looks like, make sure you practice and that it is positive. No matter if you're talking with a third-party recruiter like myself, or if you're talking with, you know, Michelle Newberry, who's internal, right? So, or Newberry Group, excuse me. So also catching a candidate in what would seem to be an embellishment or a lie is not good. So if there is a gap in your experience comparative to the job that you're interviewing for, be prepared about how you're going to talk through that, and be honest with your answer. Make sure that you're planful and explain how you are going to overcome or close that perceivable gap. So you're showing your eagerness, excitement, your understanding of what it's going to take to do the job, and you're showing the confidence that you're going to get there. Again, show the interviewer that you are the right person for the job. Someone that cannot communicate confidently their career moves or their compensation expectation, that to me is very difficult to get past. So even if you've had multiple moves, make sure that you can explain the why. You don't have to over-explain, but be sure that you are prepared if someone asks you why you've, why is it that you've made each of the career moves that you've made. And again, make sure that it's positive, right? You don't want to talk negatively about any particular employer. And then compensation-wise, as a recruiter, we work with numbers all day long. I hear it all over the board. Make sure that you know the approximate range for the job, and that you just confidently share what it is that you're looking for, or what is it compensation-wise that you're targeting as you look to make another move. And then from a logistics standpoint, here's some things that I'd also like to share. Candidates' inability to really commute to the office daily or work remotely, those are some of the things that aren't going to work, right? So if logistically, if the job is an hour and a half from where you live, and you know that that's not a commute that you can do, right? You don't want to waste your time or the recruiters or the hiring managers in that process. Also, when a non-compete exists, you want to make sure that you care for that up front. Anytime there's lack of required knowledge. So on a job description, if it says preferred or if it says required, make sure that you recognize that and you take that in. If there's a certain licensure that's required, let's say it's a CPA, and it says that a CPA is required and you don't have a CPA, unless you know someone that's within the company that you can network with and talk with a little bit more about what that really looks like, most likely it's going to be a knockout factor for you. Now, if a CPA is preferred and you don't have one, absolutely. It is absolutely worth the consideration. And then also, it sounds silly, but, inability to pass the required background checks. If you know that that is not something that you can do, you don't want to necessarily waste the time, right? For yourself or for the company. Becky, Michelle, anything else?
I would add, and this really goes along with researching the company that you're applying for, and really knowing their values. A knockout for me in an interview is when someone answers a question or behaves in a way or shares information in the interview that is counter to the culture. And I know we all have horror stories of what we've heard people say and do in interviews. But I can recall a specific time. I came from SSM Health, and we had some pretty strong values, and one of them was respect, compassion, blah, blah, blah. There's lots more. But the response that came was not respectful to people of all abilities and diverse backgrounds. And so there was a lack of compassion and respect in the response. And so no matter how brilliant that person might be and meet the criteria for the role, they're not going to be able to uphold the values of the organization. And that's a knockout. And so just make sure that your values align with the organization that you're applying to. And self-select out of the process. I think a lot of organizations are doing a very good job these days of really telling who they are and sharing their mission and sharing their values. That's part of the employer brand. And you get a choice in where you work. So take a look at that. And if you can't uphold those values, don't waste the time in applying, even if you are qualified for the job. You need to be able to uphold the mission and values of the organization. That's going to be the best fit for you and for the organization.
Awesome. Great information. And that concludes the topics that we had to cover for the session here. Is there anything in the chat box that needs to be addressed?
Looks like there's just some requests for how to really build your brand. So I think, Lori, you're going to be sending out a recording maybe to people who signed up and maybe couldn't attend today, and maybe we could add a few resources to that for job seekers who are here today.
Okay, awesome. Oh, one more question.
So how to order job experience. This really should be in chronological order. So really just go with naturally how your career has progressed. It needs to be in that order. That's what allows the recruiter or the hiring manager to follow your story. Again, with recruiters who are looking at your resume for a couple of seconds, if in a couple of seconds all they have is questions, that's not a good thing. You want to make sure that you are telling your story, showing your career progression so that the recruiter wants to take that step to progress you to the next round, instead of having questions like, what does that mean? And what did she do then? Right, and let's see, this next one, what if the most relevant experience is from 20 years ago? What would you guys say to that?
Really depends on what what the job is. You know, if it's a technical job and you're leveraging experience from 20 years ago, it's likely too dated. So, you know, I represent an IT organization, and kind of our rule of thumb is if they haven't used the technology in over 5 years, it's too outdated. So, again, I mean, it certainly would depend on the job itself that you're applying to. Working on a college campus. Okay. Yeah. I mean, if you've in any way used those skills and, you know, more current positions, that's likely going to help. You know, maybe it's not direct experience. The direct experience is 20 years ago, but maybe you've utilized that skill set in an indirect capacity. Maybe there's some way to explain your story in more recent roles. But yeah, we kind of touched on, you know, Marcy did. And Marcy, what was your rule of thumb on going back, on how far to go back, listing employers?
Yeah, so as long as it's relevant, 15, 20, 25 years, but it's really more so about relevant to the position that you're applying for. And in this case, if your work experience is 20 plus years old, really spend a lot more time on that profile statement so that you can help tell your broader story. For example, there's a lot of folks that decide they're going to stay home for a period. And, you know, don't be afraid to fill in that gap with some of that and say what you have been doing, right? And the skills that you have built during that gap period, working from home or whatever that looks like. But yeah.
Yeah, good question. And this just came up. What if the reason I stayed home was to raise my kids? Absolutely call that out. There are actually programs that are for moms who are returning to the workforce, specifically built for that. Like, what does reentry look like for a mom who took off a number of years for raising children? So absolutely call that out and share, why you were away. I think the other example that I've heard before is, some adults have taken off to care for an aging parent. It's happening more and more and more these days. So call that out. I mean, I think that's something to be proud for, that you determined that you needed to take a step away to care for your kids, to care for a spouse, to care for a aging parent. Tell that story. Absolutely.
And another thing to add to that, Becky, is that there is a lot of buzz and a lot of excitement about people who are deciding to return to work. So historically, it seemed like it could have been a little bit overwhelming to make a transition and change careers after a gap for whatever reason. There is an organization called Project Mom that I think, is that out of Chicago? I'm not sure, I apologize. But anyway, it's a national organization and they work with companies. Ameren is actually part of their they're using Project Mom, but essentially what it does is it takes people who have really great skills, maybe are either have taken off a period of time or ready to make a shift in their career and really help them get there. So don't be afraid to kind of do some research in that area as well, because there's a lot more buzz that's happening around that. So it's a good time. It's an exciting time for anyone looking to return to work, and it's a great time to do so.
Yeah, and I also think just with the focus that's going into 2021 on diversity, equity, and inclusion, I mean, I know some organizations, that's been top of mind for a long time, but some organizations are just jumping on that bandwagon. It's the right thing to do. But we need moms, we need older workers, we need diversity, we need everybody. And so I think that this is just a great time to jump into the workforce if you've been away for a little bit.
How do you recommend in that instance when there's maybe been a 20-year gap because you stayed home to raise your children, how would you put that on your resume to address that gap?
I think you could list it. I've seen people put stay-at-home mom as their job title. And
yes, CEO of your household.
Yeah, it's a job. I think it's okay to say that. And that's what you were doing. Absolutely. And then you can share what you did prior to that, and going back past 10 years because you stayed at home for a number of years. But show what you did before that. And then you took a step back to take care for your family. And then you decided to return to the workforce.
Yes. One, I think important piece too is, so you can't get around the applicant tracking system and you can't get around applying. So when your resume does have holes in it, when it does have gaps, including a cover letter is super important. So you can take the time to explain your gaps. And even if it was staying home with kids, don't hide behind that. I mean, the future is all in flexibility and supporting, working moms. And, so those are the organizations that you certainly are going to want to take the time to explain your story, and do that in a cover letter, because the unemployment rate, as we know, is so high, and taking that time to include your cover letter really could be the point between you moving forward in the candidate process or not. So if there's not a cover letter explaining gaps, I mean, it's really challenging to make it past that first hurdle. So and cover letters are important, even if it's explaining that, that you've taken time off for an extended period, and just what you're interested in lying ahead, and, that you do have relatable skills, and kind of touching on those so that you can be competitive in the applicant's screening process.
And include also any type of certifications you're working towards or anything like that that is really showing that you're doing the work to help bridge the gap as well, or updating your technical training in whatever way. So yeah, so I would make sure to include that on your resume as well.
I think that's a great point about certifications. Marcy, I know Michelle, you touched on this earlier, but certifications to me show applied knowledge. So, you know, a lot of questions come up these days about degrees and do I need to go back to school? And I think it depends. Some organizations, you know, still require bachelor's degrees. Some positions require master's degrees. But I do think that there is a stronger emphasis now more than ever on certifications. Take the HR space, for example. Having your certification through HRCI or SHRM is a huge selling point. So do some research on your industry and see what are those certifications that might be new in your line of work that weren't there 20 years ago. And maybe sit down for those exams and study for them. That makes you a stronger candidate, I think, when you have the certifications that show the applied knowledge. Just the way that some of those tests are. I know SHRM, for example, they are testing scenarios with you, and you have to show and prove your knowledge to get that certification. And so I think that is huge. So research those certifications that are out there. Some community colleges also have certification courses that you can take in a variety of different areas. So if you've been out of a certain space for 20 years and you want to get back into it, you might check out what certifications are available, you know, through your local community college.
We had one more question that came up that talked about, like, quote, old relevant employment and where to add that. I think it's stated beautifully. If there's other relevant experience, I see that a lot in resumes. I love seeing it. Put it towards the bottom so it's in chronological order, and you can just simply state the company, your title, and the years of employment, and leave it at that.
Awesome. Well, really great information. And so this will conclude our Ask the Expert session today. So special thanks to the Lewis and Clark SHRM chapter, and especially to Becky, Michelle, and Marcy for being with us today. If anyone would like information on Lewis and Clark SHRM, please go to lewisandclarkSHRM.org. For more information on any of the services and resources available here at the Missouri Job Center, please call us at 636-255-6060, or you can email us at workforce@sccmo.org. So thank you so much.